Flip a switch, and the darkness vanishes. We take the miracle of the electrical grid for granted, but it is the most complex machine ever built by human hands. It is a silent, pulsing web of copper and light that powers every breath of modern industry. But this invisible thread is more fragile than it looks, and its history is written in coal, oil, and the pursuit of absolute power. Before the wire, before the pipe, and long before the electron, the foundation of fortune was built on the most primitive of grids, the forest. For the vast majority of human history, energy was not a service you subscribed to or a commodity traded on a digital exchange. It was a physical resource you held by the throat through territorial force. In the ancient and medieval worlds, the fire monopoly belonged to those who controlled the land titles to wood and peat. This was a brutal, localized economy where the grid was simply the distance a team of oxen could drag a bundle of timber before the energy spent on transport exceeded the energy contained in the load. The primary financial driver of this era was thermal sovereignty. In ancient Rome and throughout the Middle Ages, heat was the ultimate signifier of class and the primary tool of survival. The first energy barons were the landowners, monarchs, and feudal lords who held the titles to old-growth forests. Because wood was used for every facet of existence, from smelting the iron for a knight's sword to baking the commoner's bread and heating the drafty stone villas of the elite, the demand was perfectly inelastic. If you owned the trees, you owned the lifeblood of the community. This led to a fortune of scarcity. As cities like London and Paris grew, the concentric circles of forests around them were decimated, forcing the price of fire to skyrocket. Winter was not just a season. It was a debt cycle that the poor often paid for with their lives, while the lords harvested the thermal rent of the land. The financial architecture of the fire monopoly was managed through complex legal frameworks known as the rights of estovas and fuelwood tithes. These were history's earliest energy contracts. A peasant might be granted the right to collect dead wood or windfall from a lord's forest, essentially the scraps of the grid, in exchange for grueling labor or a significant portion of their harvest. However, the high-value green wood and charcoal were strictly protected as state-level assets. Charcoal, in particular, was the refined fuel of the era. It required a labor-intensive, specialized process of slow-burning wood in oxygen-deprived pits, managed by a class of fringe workers known as colliers. These charcoal burners were the first energy engineers, living in the deep woods to produce a high-density, portable fuel that could reach the temperatures necessary for industrial metallurgy. By controlling the kilns, the elite could control the production of wealth itself. The grid of this era had a massive logistical ceiling. Wood is bulky, heavy, and has a relatively low energy density compared to modern fossil fuels. This created an Energyland paradox. Wealth was geographically trapped by the weight of its fuel. You couldn't move the grid to where people wanted to live. You had to move the industry to the forest. This is why early iron smelting, glass blowing, and salt boiling centers were always located in the heart of deep woodland. When the wood within a 10-mile radius ran out, the fortune simply vanished, and the entire industrial operation was forced to migrate like a nomadic tribe. This slash-and-burn capitalism defined the boundaries of ancient empires. If a king couldn't secure a steady supply of wood, his grid collapsed, his army couldn't be armed, and his population would descend into revolt during a particularly cold decade. However, the fire monopoly eventually hit a wall of ecological bankruptcy. By the 16th and 17th centuries, particularly in Britain, the forests were virtually gone, sacrificed to the relentless hunger of the shipyards and the iron forges. This wasn't just an environmental disaster, it was a total economic meltdown. The price of firewood became so high that it was often more expensive to heat a home for a month than to pay the rent itself. This desperation led to the Great Wood Shortage, a crisis that threatened to stall human progress permanently. This was the precise moment the foundation of fortune was forced to pivot. The elite, realizing their surface-level assets were depleted, were forced to look beneath the earth for a new fire. They found a black diamond that was initially reviled. It was dirty, sulfurous, and difficult to extract, but it contained an energy density that wood could never match. The legacy of the fire monopoly is the realization that energy is the ultimate control variable of civilization. The transition from the forest to the mine wasn't just a change in fuel, it was the birth of the industrial empire and the first step toward a centralized, globalized grid. The fortune was about to scale from the village woods to the deep veins of the earth, and the men who followed it were about to become the richest humans to ever walk the planet. The fire monopoly proved that energy is a necessity that will always find a market, no matter the cost. But as the trees disappeared, the race was on to find a deeper, darker, and more concentrated source of power. As the fire monopoly of the forests collapsed under the weight of its own exhaustion, the foundation of fortune descended into the dark, sulfurous veins of the earth. This was the era of the Black Diamond, a period spanning the late 17th to the mid-19th century, where the British Empire essentially hacked the energy limits of the biological world. While the rest of the globe was still tethered to the slow growth of timber, Britain discovered that a single acre of coal-bearing land contained more energy than hundreds of acres of prime woodland could produce in a century. This transition was not merely a change in fuel, it was the birth of subsurface capitalism, where wealth was no longer a function of how much land you could see, but how much volume you could extract from beneath it. The primary financial driver of this era was the unique legal concept of mineral rights. In most of Europe, everything beneath the soil belonged to the crown. But in Britain, a 1568 court ruling known as the Case of Mines established that while gold and silver belonged to the Queen, base metals and coal belonged to the landowner. This created an unprecedented incentive for private investment. The fortune was found in the vertical arbitrage of the soil. A landowner in Northumberland could see the value of his estate jump from a modest agricultural yield of perhaps £50 per year, roughly $12,000 today, to a mining royalty worth £5,000 per year, over $1.2 million today, almost overnight. This sparked the first great energy rush, turning pastoral lords into coal kings who treated their estates like underground mints. The financial heart of the Black Diamond era was the London coal trade, a massive maritime grid that connected the northern mines to the southern markets. Because overland transport was prohibitively expensive, costing roughly 20 shillings, $250 today, to move a ton of coal just 20 miles, the industry relied on sea coal. By 1700, London was consuming over 500,000 tons of coal annually. A single chaldron of coal, about 1.3 tons, sold for roughly 30 shillings in London, with nearly half of that price being pure friction cost, shipping, handling, and the Great Sea Coal Tax. This tax was so lucrative that it financed the rebuilding of 50 London churches, including St. Paul's Cathedral, after the Great Fire of 1666. The foundation of fortune was essentially a tax on the coal. The crown and the city grew rich by clipping a coupon off every hearth in the capital. The complexity of the coal grid birthed the first era of infrastructure financing. As mines went deeper to meet demand, they hit a physical wall: water. For every ton of coal extracted, several tons of water had to be pumped out, or the fortune would drown. This led to the development of the atmospheric engine, the precursor to the steam engine, which was essentially a massive capital investment designed to protect the Black Diamond assets. In 1712, a Newcomen engine cost roughly £1,000 to build, roughly $240,000 today. For a mine owner, this was a high-stakes capex gamble. If the engine worked, the mine remained a cash machine. If it failed, the investment was a total loss. This was the moment the grid became capital-intensive, requiring sophisticated banking and joint stock arrangements to manage the extreme risks of deep earth extraction. By the late 1700s, the foundation of fortune moved into logistical disruption. The Duke of Bridgewater, facing a bottleneck in getting his coal to the booming textile mills of Manchester, invested his entire family fortune, roughly £168,000, equivalent to over $40 million today, to build the Bridgewater Canal. It was a classic infrastructure play. Before the canal, coal in Manchester cost 12 pence per hundredweight. After the canal opened in 1761, the price dropped to 6 pence. While the consumers saved money, the Duke became the richest man in Britain. He had realized that the real wealth wasn't in the coal itself, but in the control of the channel. By owning the grid between the mine and the mill, he could take a micro-toll on every unit of energy that entered the industrial heartland. The scale of the black diamond fortune was staggering. By 1850, Britain was producing 50 million tons of coal a year, representing nearly two-thirds of the world's supply. This energy density allowed for the piston revolution, but it also created the first global energy imbalance. The nations that sat on coal became the masters of the world, while those that relied on the old fire monopoly of wood fell behind into colonial subservience. The fortune was no longer a local matter of keeping a village warm, it was the foundation of the British pound, which was effectively backed by the energy content of the coal fields. The legacy of the black diamond is the creation of the commodity grid. It taught the world that energy could be standardized, weighed, and traded across oceans. However, this fortune came with a new kind of invisible debt, the environmental cost of smoke and the social cost of the pit. As the coal piles grew, so did the realization that moving the black diamond by hand and horse was no longer enough. The world needed a way to turn that heat into massive, autonomous motion. The foundation of fortune was about to shift from the mineral in the ground to the pressure in the pipe. The black diamond era turned the Earth's crust into a bank account, but it was a stationary one. To truly unlock the global potential of this energy, the world had to find a way to make the heat move things. If the black diamond era was about the raw accumulation of potential energy, the era of steam and steel was about the violent, profitable release of that potential. Spanning roughly from 1770 to 1860, this period represents the first time in human history that the grid moved from a stationary resource, the mine, into a dynamic, controllable force of nature, the piston. The foundation of fortune underwent a fundamental shift. Wealth was no longer found just in owning the dirt, but in owning the pressure. This transition created the first true industrial dynasties by turning the heat of coal into the mechanical rhythm of the modern world. The primary financial driver of this era was a concept we now take for granted, the efficiency rent. This was the stroke of genius behind the partnership of James Watt and Matthew Boulton. In the 1770s, the existing Newcomen engines were incredibly wasteful, essentially eating the profits of mine owners through massive coal consumption. Watt's separate condenser made the engine roughly 3 times more efficient. However, Boulton and Watt didn't just sell their engines for a one-time flat fee. Instead, they pioneered the world's first performance-based energy contract. Their business model was ruthless and brilliant. They required customers to pay them a royalty equal to 1/3 of the value of the coal saved by using a Watt engine instead of a Newcomen engine. This contract typically lasted for 25 years. This turned the grid into a recurring revenue stream, effectively making Boulton and Watt the first energy-as-a-service providers. To put the numbers in perspective, if a large mine saved £2,400 in coal annually, roughly $550,000 in today's purchasing power, Boulton and Watt would pocket £800 a year, about $185,000, in pure, passive royalty. By 1800, they had installed nearly 500 engines, amassing a fortune that allowed them to dominate the industrial landscape. The foundation of fortune required a shift in material capital. Containing high-pressure steam necessitated precision, birthing the steel hegemony. Ironmaster John Wilkinson reproposed cannon boring technology to machine Watt cylinders to required tolerances. By the early 1800s, top-tier engines cost £3,000. Wealth shifted toward high-precision assets capable of withstanding thermodynamic expansion. This transition to steam fundamentally altered the unit economics of the global economy. Before the piston, a factory was a prisoner of geography. It had to be built beside a fast-moving river to utilize water power. This was remote capital, expensive to build, seasonal, and far from the labor force. Steam power allowed the factory to be unplugged from the river and moved into the city. While the initial capital expenditure for a steam-powered mill was higher, often reaching £20,000, nearly $4.5 million today, the operating margins were significantly better. Urban factories could run 24 hours a day, regardless of drought or a frozen river, and they sat right next to the massive, cheap labor pools of the Victorian era. Urban concentration sparked a real estate windfall. Manchester and Birmingham land prices surged to £100 per square yard as manufacturers prioritized proximity to coal hubs. The fortune was shared between engine builders, factory owners, and urban landlords who controlled the city's energy footprint. The final and most aggressive foundation of fortune in this era was the physical grid of the railroad. By the 1830s, the steam engine was put on wheels. This was the mobile grid of the 19th century. If you could move energy and products at 30 miles per hour instead of 3 miles per hour, you essentially captured the time value of money. The railway mania of the 1840s in Britain saw an incredible £200 million, roughly $28 billion today, of private capital poured into iron tracks. For context, this was nearly 40% of Britain's entire GDP at the time. Investors chased the natural monopoly of the right-of-way. Controlling the only high-speed energy pipe between points, railway companies profited from the price differential of goods. A 15-shilling spread on coal served as a network toll, creating railway kings like George Hudson, who controlled vast tracts and immense global power. However, the steam and steel fortune had a brutal high-pressure risk. The railway mania eventually led to the massive stock market crash of 1847. Investors realized that while the physics of steam were sound, the financial valuations were often built on speculative hot air. Many of these lines were built to nowhere, and the infrastructure couldn't generate the returns needed to pay back the massive debt. This crash taught the financial world a vital lesson about the grid. Infrastructure is only as valuable as its utilization rate. The legacy of this era is the institutionalization of the engine. It taught the world that wealth is generated by the conversion of heat into work. In the language of physics, this is defined by the work integral. For the 19th century industrialist, every cubic inch of gas expansion was a microtransaction of profit. But as soot-coated London, Pennsylvania refined a new liquid fire. Cleaner, portable, and energy-dense, it rendered steam engines obsolete. The foundation of fortune shifted from the iron piston to the kerosene lamp. The steam and steel era proved that movement is money, and that those who control the pressure control the world. But the iron horse was still a heavy, clunky beast tethered to the coal mine. To truly globalize the grid, the world needed a fuel that could be pumped, bottled, and burned without the massive weight of a boiler. In the mid-1850s, the world was literally running out of light. The fire monopoly of the forests was a smoldering memory, and the black diamond of coal was excellent for driving pistons, but it was a smoky, foul-smelling disaster for lighting a living room. For the global elite, light came from whale oil, a foundation of fortune that required sailing halfway across the globe to slaughter giant mammals for their head matter. By 1850, a gallon of premium spermaceti oil cost roughly $2.50, which translates to about $95 today. Light was a luxury of the ultra-rich, while everyone else lived in the dim, dangerous, and soot-filled flicker of tallow candles. The Rockefeller pivot changed the chemistry of human civilization by democratizing the night. In 1859, Edwin Drake struck black gold in Titusville, Pennsylvania, but the real fortune wasn't made by the men covered in mud at the wellhead. It was captured by a young, austere bookkeeper in Cleveland named John D. Rockefeller. He realized a fundamental law of the grid that remains true today: control the bottleneck, control the world. Drilling for oil was a chaotic, high-speed gamble. For every successful gusher, 10 men went bankrupt. Rockefeller chose a different path, focusing on the midstream, the refining of raw rock oil into kerosene, the liquid fire that could safely illuminate every home on Earth. By 1870, Rockefeller formed Standard Oil with an initial capital of $1 million, roughly $25 million today. His strategy was one of ruthless horizontal integration. He didn't want to own every well, he wanted to own every refinery. If you owned the refineries, the drillers were forced to sell to you at your price, and the consumers were forced to buy from you at your price. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled 90% of the refining capacity in the United States. He had turned a chaotic resource rush into a disciplined, centralized machine. To cement this monopoly, Rockefeller turned to the mobile grid of the previous era, the railroads. He struck secret deals with the railway kings, offering them a guaranteed, massive volume of oil shipments in exchange for rebates. The most predatory aspect of this foundation of fortune was a mechanism known as the drawback. Rockefeller didn't just receive a discount on his own shipments, he forced the railroads to pay him a percentage of the shipping fees paid by his competitors. It was the ultimate network toll, making it mathematically impossible for any other oil company to survive. By the late 1870s, Standard Oil was effectively a private government, dictating the terms of energy to the entire American continent. Yet, Rockefeller's fortune was built on a paradox. He gained total power by making energy significantly cheaper. In 1860, a gallon of kerosene cost roughly 58 cents. By 1885, through the brutal efficiency of his system, he had driven the price down to 8 cents per gallon. For the first time in history, the common man could afford to turn night into day, and the global standard of living became inextricably tied to the standard of oil. Rockefeller's personal net worth climbed toward a peak of roughly $900 million. While that sounds modest by modern billionaire standards, it represented nearly 2% of the entire U.S. economy at the time. Adjusted for the relative size of the economy today, that is a fortune exceeding $400 billion, making him arguably the wealthiest individual in history. The final piece of the Rockefeller pivot was the invention of the fluid grid. When the railroads eventually tried to push back against his dominance, Rockefeller simply bypassed them by building the world's first long-distance pipelines. He moved energy silently through iron pipes buried in the earth, controlled by a single man at a desk hundreds of miles away. This infrastructure was so efficient that it made the very idea of competition look like a waste of resources, creating the blueprint for the natural monopoly. By the time the U.S. Supreme Court declared Standard Oil an illegal monopoly in 1911 and ordered it broken into 34 independent companies, the ancestors of today's Exxon, Mobil, and Chevron, the foundation of fortune had already shifted. The breakup actually made Rockefeller even wealthier as the individual pieces of the grid proved more valuable than the whole. However, as the age of the kerosene lamp began to flicker out, a new, invisible force was emerging from the laboratories of Menlo Park. The grid was about to leave the liquid in the pipe and enter the pulse in the wire. The Rockefeller pivot proved that if you control the refining and the transit, you own the energy of the age. But as the 19th century closed, a new battle was brewing, not over who owned the oil, but over which type of invisible force would power the 20th century. By the 1880s, the foundation of fortune shifted from the tangible to the invisible. If the previous era was about moving liquids through pipes, this era was about moving a mysterious, weightless force through copper wires, electricity. This was the War of Currents, a high-stakes corporate cage match between Thomas Edison and George Westinghouse. It was a battle not just over technology, but over the fundamental architecture of the 20th century economy. The winner would decide whether the grid would be a series of small, local pockets of power or a vast, continental machine. The primary financial driver of this era was the standardization play. Thomas Edison, backed by the deep pockets of J.P. Morgan, launched the age of electricity with direct current, DC. In 1882, Edison opened the Pearl Street station in New York City with a capital investment of roughly $300,000, about $9 million today. His business model was a direct evolution of the Rockefeller bottleneck. He wanted to own the entire stack. Edison's company held the patents for the light bulb, the generator, and the meters. If you wanted light, you had to buy the entire ecosystem from him. However, DC had a fatal physical flaw. It couldn't be transmitted more than a mile without losing massive amounts of voltage. This meant an Edison grid required a power plant on every street corner, a massively inefficient and capital-heavy way to wire a world. Enter George Westinghouse, a man who had already made a fortune in steam and steel with his air brakes for railroads. Westinghouse, alongside the brilliant Serbian inventor Nikola Tesla, bet everything on alternating current, AC. AC was the ultimate network multiplier. Using transformers, AC could be stepped up to high voltages for long-distance travel and stepped down for home use. This meant a single power plant located at a distant coal mine or waterfall could power an entire city. The foundation of fortune moved from local monopoly to regional scalability. For Westinghouse, the goal wasn't just to sell a light bulb, it was to own the highways of the electron. The conflict turned into a brutal propaganda war. Edison, desperate to protect his massive sunk cost in DC infrastructure, launched a smear campaign against AC, labeling it the executioner's current. He famously organized public demonstrations where he electrocuted stray animals and even lobbied for AC to be used in the first electric chair to link Westinghouse technology with death in the public mind. This was regulatory capture in its infancy, using fear and legislation to protect an inferior technological moat. But the economics of AC were simply too powerful to ignore. The capital cost of building one large AC plant was significantly lower than building 50 small DC stations. The turning point came at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. Westinghouse underbid Edison's newly formed General Electric by nearly $500,000, about $17 million today, to light the White City. When the switch was flipped, and 100,000 incandescent lamps glowed simultaneously using Tesla's polyphase system, the world realized that AC was the future. This led to the ultimate foundation of fortune, the Niagara Falls Power Project. By 1896, AC power was being transmitted 26 miles to Buffalo, New York. The grid had finally broken free from the limits of geography. Power was no longer something you generated where you lived, it was something that was delivered from over the horizon. The financial fallout of this war was a massive consolidation. J.P. Morgan, seeing that Edison was losing the tech war, ruthlessly pushed Edison out of his own company, merging Edison General Electric with its rival Thomson Houston to create the modern General Electric, GE. Morgan realized that the real fortune wasn't in the inventor's ego, but in the patent pool and the system integration. By 1892, GE was a $50 million juggernaut, over $1.6 billion today. The grid was no longer a hobby for geniuses, it was a blue-chip asset for the world's most powerful bankers. The legacy of the war of currents is the centralized utility model. It established the natural monopoly of the electric company, a single entity that owns the wires and the generation, regulated by the state to ensure universal service. The wealth generated was no longer just about the sale of a commodity like kerosene, it was about the connection fee. Once a wire was run into a home, that customer was tethered to the grid for life. The foundation of fortune had become a permanent, recurring tax on modern existence, providing a level of predictable cash flow that would eventually make the utility sector the widows' and orphans' bedrock of the global stock market. The war of currents proved that the most efficient network always wins, but building that network required a literal mountain of metal. As the wires began to stretch across continents, the foundation of fortune moved into the physical material that made the invisible pulse possible. As the war of currents concluded, the foundation of fortune moved from the abstract battle of physics into the heavy, industrial reality of the Earth's crust. To build the pulse of the wire that Westinghouse and Edison had envisioned, the world required a physical nervous system. This was the era of the copper web, a period where wealth was no longer just about the spark, but about the conductor. If you wanted to move power from a distant Niagara Falls to a kitchen in Buffalo, you needed thousands of miles of high-purity red metal. The grid was no longer a laboratory experiment, it was a massive, hungry consumer of raw materials. The primary financial driver of this era was conductive scarcity. Copper was the only material with the perfect balance of ductility and electrical conductivity to make a transcontinental grid possible. This created a new class of energy barons, the Copper Kings. In places like Butte, Montana, men like Marcus Daly and William A. Clark sat atop the richest hill on Earth. By the 1890s, the Anaconda Copper Mining Company was producing over $50 million worth of copper annually, roughly $1.7 billion today. These men realized that they didn't need to win the war of currents, they just needed to be the ones selling the bottles for the lightning. Every mile of new electric line required roughly 2,000 pounds of copper. The financial architecture of the copper web was defined by the consolidation of the mines. Just as Rockefeller had centralized oil, banking titans like the Guggenheims and the Rockefellers, moving into minerals, began to buy up the supply chain. They moved the foundation of fortune from the pit to the smelter and the exchange. By 1899, the Amalgamated Copper Company was formed with a staggering capital of $75 million, about $2.7 billion today. This was a trust of conductors. By controlling the price of the physical wire, they held a silent veto over how fast a city could modernize. If the price of copper rose by a few cents, the expansion of the grid stalled. If it fell, the web spread like wildfire. This era also birthed the infrastructure bond. Building a grid was a front-loaded capital nightmare. You had to spend millions on copper and poles before a single customer could turn on a light. To solve this, the utility industry pioneered the use of long-term, low-interest debt. Investors shifted from the gamble of mining stocks to the safety of utility bonds. A typical 30-year bond might offer a 5% yield, backed by the inelastic demand of a city that could no longer function in the dark. The fortune became a game of interest rate arbitrage. Borrow at 5% to build a copper network that yielded 10% in connection fees. The final element of the copper web was urban density wealth. The web was most profitable in the city, where thousands of customers could be reached with a single mile of wire. This created a massive infrastructure premium for city real estate. A building wired for electric could command rents 20% to 30% higher than a gaslit neighbor. The grid was effectively a value-added tax on the city's footprint. By 1910, the U.S. was using over 600,000 tons of copper a year just for electrical applications. The red metal had become the gold standard of the industrial age, a physical manifestation of the invisible power that now dictated the pace of human life. The legacy of the copper web is the realization that a network is only as strong as its physical components. It taught the world that the grid is not just a service, but a massive, depreciating asset that requires constant maintenance and immense quantities of natural resources. But even as the wires reached the furthest corners of the city, a new hunger was growing. People didn't just want their homes to have power, they wanted to take that power with them. The grid was about to grow wheels. The copper web wired the world in place, creating the first truly connected society. But the foundation of fortune was about to undergo its most aggressive expansion yet, moving from the stationary home to the moving machine. While the copper web was busy wiring the world in place, a second, parallel grid was being built that would eventually dwarf the first in terms of sheer unregulated wealth. This was the mobile grid, fueled not by copper pulses but by the explosion of liquid hydrocarbons. By the early 1900s, the foundation of fortune underwent a violent split. The electric utility stayed behind in the home, while a new breed of titans realized that the truly astronomical money lay in human movement. This was the era of the internal combustion engine, a technology that turned a dangerous, discarded byproduct of Rockefeller's kerosene, gasoline, into the most valuable liquid on the planet. The primary financial driver of this era was energy density per kilogram. While a battery in 1910 weighed hundreds of pounds and could barely move a carriage 20 miles, a single gallon of gasoline contained the explosive energy of roughly 33 kilowatt-hours. This physical reality created a fortune of convenience. In 1908, Henry Ford released the Model T, priced at $825, roughly $26,000 today. Ford didn't just build a car, he built a demand machine for the oil industry. By 1927, he had sold 15 million cars. This created a secondary foundation of fortune in infrastructure lag. The world had cars, but no roads. This led to the Federal Aid Highway Act, which effectively used public taxpayer capital to build the mobile grid infrastructure that private oil and auto companies required to grow. By 1930, the U.S. was spending over $1 billion annually on roads, a massive subsidy for the internal combustion economy. The wealth generated here was different from the utility wealth of previous segments. Utility wealth was regulated and capped by the state. Internal combustion wealth was wild, global, and exponential. This birthed the automotive aristocracy. By 1925, General Motors had become a financial juggernaut by introducing consumer credit. They realized the foundation of fortune wasn't just in the engine, but in the debt used to buy it. For the first time, the grid was financed by the individual consumer's future earnings. The fortune moved from the engine block to the ledger sheet, as GM became the first corporation in history to make more money from financing and interest than from manufacturing. This era saw the birth of the petrochemical fortune. Engines required lubrication and rubber, making DuPont and Goodyear pillars of the mobile grid. This was the friction fortune. Every mile driven was a microtransaction of wear. To ensure dominance, a consortium including GM and Firestone formed National City Lines, dismantling electric streetcars in 45 cities. This Great American Streetcar Scandal proved fortunes are built both by creating products and eliminating competition. The financial scale of this transition was staggering. In 1910, the total value of the U.S. automotive industry was roughly $225 million. By 1929, it had surged to $3.7 billion, nearly $65 billion today. This wasn't just growth, it was a total restructuring of how capital flowed through the economy. The mobile grid became the primary engine of the banking sector. Wall Street shifted its focus from the bonded utility to the growth equities of Detroit. The capitalization of the big three automakers created a gravity well that pulled in the steel, glass, and rubber industries. This formed an industrial interdependency where the health of the national bank was directly tied to the number of gallons of gasoline burned every Saturday afternoon. The foundation of fortune relied on the psychology of the open road. Unlike the fixed grid, the mobile grid was sold as freedom. This marketing allowed oil companies to brand gasoline, giving rise to Shell, Texaco, and Gulf, and command premiums utilities couldn't achieve. By the 1920s, 120,000 gas stations acted as high-margin retail nodes, selling fuel and perpetual machine maintenance. The internal combustion era's greatest impact was the geographic expansion of value. By unlocking the suburbs, the car created the real estate energy complex. Developers transformed worthless scrubland into accessible property, leading to suburban sprawl, a layout making cars and fuel mandatory. By 1940, the automotive and oil sectors comprised 20% of the U.S. economy. The foundation of fortune became a sprawl tax, where participation in modern life required paying combustion titans for every mile traveled. This was the ultimate lock-in, a civilization physically redesigned to ensure the mobile grid could never be turned off. But this explosion in demand created a desperate problem of supply. The oil fields of Pennsylvania and Texas were no longer enough to fuel a world on wheels. The foundation of fortune had to look beyond national borders. The mobile grid was becoming so essential to national survival that it ceased to be a mere business. It became a matter of national security. The era of the lone wildcatter was ending, and the era of the global cartel was beginning. The search for the black gold moved to the sands of the Middle East, where the stakes would be measured not just in dollars, but in blood. The world was about to realize that the freedom of the road was entirely dependent on a handful of men who controlled the global tap. The internal combustion era turned every citizen into a perpetual subscriber of the mobile grid. But as the engines multiplied, the control of the supply shifted into the hands of a few secretive, global masters who would manage the flow of the world's lifeblood for the next half-century. By the mid-20th century, the foundation of fortune shifted from the mechanical ingenuity of the engine to the cold calculated control of global supply. This was the era of the Seven Sisters, a term coined by Enrico Motte to describe the cartel of oil giants, Anglo-Persian, now BP, Gulf Oil, Mobil, Exxon, Chevron, Royal Dutch Shell, and Texaco, that ruled the world's energy markets from the 1940s to the 1970s. These companies realized that while the electric grid was being nationalized or heavily regulated, the oil grid remained a private, global playground. If you controlled the tap of the global flow, you didn't just own a business, you dictated the pace of modern civilization itself. The primary financial driver of this era was vertical integration on a planetary scale. Unlike the Standard Oil monopoly that was broken up, the Seven Sisters operated as a de facto global oligopoly. They owned the entire value chain, the concessions in the Middle East, the tankers on the high seas, the refineries in Europe, and the gas stations in the Americas. The fortune was found in the transfer price. By moving oil between their own subsidiaries, they could park profits in low-tax jurisdictions and keep the price of crude artificially stable. For nearly 25 years, the price of oil remained remarkably steady at around $3 per barrel, roughly $35 today. This predictable cheap energy was the hidden subsidy that fueled the post-World War II economic miracle. The foundation of fortune during this period was secured through concession agreements. These were legal contracts that gave the Seven Sisters exclusive rights to explore and extract oil from entire nations, such as Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, for up to 60 years. In many cases, these agreements covered the entire geographic territory of a country. The financial terms were staggeringly one-sided. The host countries often received a small royalty, while the sisters harvested oil that cost as little as 10 cents to pump and sold it for $3. This was the ultimate resource arbitrage, creating profit margins that allowed these companies to build internal bureaucracies more powerful than the governments of the nations where they operated. By 1950, the Seven Sisters controlled 90% of the oil production outside of the United States and the Soviet Union. Beyond the balance sheet, the true power of the Seven Sisters was geopolitical leverage. They functioned as the unofficial external energy ministry for Western powers. When Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh of Iran attempted to nationalize his country's oil in 1951, the sisters orchestrated a global boycott, proving that a nation's resources are worthless if they cannot access the global grid. This demonstrated that the right to sell was just as valuable as the right to drill. The fortune was protected not just by lawyers and accountants, but by the strategic interests of superpowers. This was the era of petrodiplomacy, where the energy grid became the primary tool of international statecraft, and corporate interests were indistinguishable from national security. The financial architecture of this era also introduced the petrodollar recycling system. As the sisters extracted more oil to feed a world on wheels, the massive current account surpluses of the producing nations flowed back into Western banks. These banks then loaned that capital to developing nations to build the very infrastructure, roads, airports, and power plants that required more oil. It was a perfect, self-reinforcing loop of capital. The foundation of fortune was no longer just the liquid itself, it was the financial plumbing that handled the proceeds of that liquid. By 1960, the Seven Sisters were so entrenched that they could effectively veto the industrial policy of entire continents simply by adjusting their supply quotas. To maximize the fortune of the mobile grid, the sisters and their automotive allies engaged in demand engineering. They worked to ensure that the fixed grid, electricity, and the mobile grid, oil, remained separate. By fighting against the expansion of electric public transit and promoting long-haul trucking over electric rail, they ensured that the world's vascular system remained dependent on a liquid fuel they exclusively controlled. The wealth was extracted at every turn, from the wellhead to the refinery to the local service station, which became a psychological landmark of 20th century life. But the Seven Sisters model contained the seeds of its own disruption. By keeping the host nations' royalties low and their political influence high, they birthed a spirit of resentment that eventually led to the formation of OPEC in 1960. The foundation of fortune was about to undergo a nationalist pivot. The era of corporate cartels was ending, and the era of the sovereign energy state was beginning. The grid was about to be seized by the very nations that sat atop the reserves, leading to a decade of shocks that would rewrite the global order. The Seven Sisters built the most powerful cartel in human history, but they couldn't hold back the tide of national sovereignty. The foundation of fortune is about to shift from the west to the east, as the black gold becomes the ultimate tool of international power and the world experiences its first true energy squeeze. While the Seven Sisters were busy securing the mobile grid of global oil, a parallel foundation of fortune was being built out of millions of tons of concrete and steel. By the mid-1930s, the world's industrial powers realized that the most profitable way to feed the ever-expanding copper web was to harness the gravity of the Earth itself. This was the era of the hydro-hegemony, where wealth was no longer measured by the efficiency of a single engine, but by the volume of water held back by titanic walls. These were massive financial engines designed to provide the cheapest power on the planet for centuries. The primary financial driver of this era was the levelized cost of energy over extreme time horizons. Unlike a coal plant, which required a continuous, expensive OpEx of fuel, a hydroelectric dam was almost entirely CapEx. Once the dam was built, the fuel, falling water, was essentially free. This created a fortune of longevity. Projects like the Hoover Dam, completed in 1936 for $49 million, roughly $1.1 billion today, were financed by 50-year government bonds. Once those bonds were paid off, the dam became a cash cow with profit margins exceeding 90%. By controlling the water, the state and its private partners created a permanent, low-cost energy moat that could power entire regions, like Southern California, into existence from nothing but desert. The fortune of the hydro hegemony was also found in the industrial subsidy. Because hydropower was so cheap, often costing less than 1 cent per kilowatt-hour, it acted as a magnet for high-energy industries. This gave birth to the aluminum fortune. Aluminum requires massive amounts of electricity to refine. Companies like Alcoa followed the dams. In the Pacific Northwest, the Grand Coulee Dam provided the cheap electrons that allowed the U.S. to build 300,000 aircraft during World War II. The grid was no longer just about lighting homes. It was the essential ingredient for the arsenal of democracy. If you owned the hydro rights, you owned the foundation of the modern manufacturing economy. The financial engineering of this era was led by the regional monopoly model, epitomized by the Tennessee Valley Authority. By taming the Tennessee River, the government and its financiers turned one of the poorest regions in America into an industrial powerhouse. The TVA invested over $1 billion in the 1930s to build a system of 29 dams. This created a secondary fortune in land value and agricultural productivity. When you control the flow of a river, you control the irrigation, the flood risk, and the power. The grid expanded its definition to include the very survival of the landscape. This wealth was so immense that it sparked a decades-long political battle over public versus private power, as private utility titans fought to prevent the government from nationalizing the most profitable energy source ever discovered. Furthermore, the hydro hegemony established the concept of energy-driven urbanization. Cities like Las Vegas, Phoenix, and Seattle do not exist in their modern forms without the massive, consistent output of these dams. The fortune here was a multiplier effect. For every dollar spent on hydro infrastructure, $10 were created in real estate, manufacturing, and municipal tax bases. This was the grand bargain of the 20th century, government-backed infrastructure that guaranteed private sector growth. However, this required the total subjugation of the environment. Thousands of square miles of indigenous lands and ecosystems were flooded to create these concrete batteries. The financial balance sheets showed record profits, but the environmental externalities were being pushed onto future generations as a hidden debt. From a global perspective, hydro hegemony became a tool of geopolitical capital. In the mid-20th century, a nation's wealth was directly correlated with its installed hydro capacity. The Aswan High Dam in Egypt, financed with significant international maneuvering during the 1960s, was a bid for influence over the entire African continent. The fortune here wasn't just in the currency, it was in the strategic leverage of being the one who owned the tap. If the copper web was the nervous system of civilization, the hydro dams were the massive, beating hearts that kept the pressure constant and the prices low. The legacy of the hydro hegemony remains the backbone of the global grid today. These dams are the oldest money in energy, still churning out profits a century after they were built. But as the industrial world grew, even the mightiest rivers reached their limit. The foundation of fortune was about to move from the weight of the water to the heart of the atom, seeking a power source that could be built anywhere, independent of the Earth's geography. The hydro hegemony proved that the largest fortunes are built by those who can master the largest forces of nature. But even the biggest dam has a ceiling. The next phase of the grid would seek to break the geographic chains of rivers entirely by unlocking the energy stored within the very fabric of matter. In the wake of World War II, the foundation of fortune underwent its most radical transformation yet. The world had seen the terrifying power of the atom in 1945, but by the 1950s, the narrative shifted from destruction to a utopia of infinite supply. This was the era of the nuclear promise, sparked by Lewis Strauss's 1954 declaration that electricity would become too cheap to meter. For the first time, the grid wasn't dependent on the slow rot of ancient plants or the seasonal flow of rivers. It was powered by the fundamental binding energy of the universe, promising a world where energy was a background service rather than a scarce commodity. The primary financial driver of this era was energy density and sovereign independence. A single pellet of uranium, the size of a gummy bear, contains the energy equivalent of 1 ton of coal or 149 gallons of oil. This physical reality offered a fortune of autonomy. Nations like France and Japan, which lacked domestic fossil fuel reserves, saw nuclear power as a way to decouple national bank accounts from the price manipulations of the Seven Sisters. The financial goal shifted from managing a volatile global supply chain to managing a closed-loop asset. If you could master the fuel cycle, you could generate massive amounts of baseload power with almost zero carbon emissions and, theoretically, low long-term fuel costs. The financial architecture of the nuclear promise was defined by extreme capital intensity. A nuclear power plant is the ultimate front-loaded investment. While a coal plant might cost a few $100 million, a nuclear station like Oyster Creek, the first turnkey plant in 1963, required billions in today's currency. The foundation of fortune was built on the cost of capital. Because these projects took 10 to 15 years to build, the interest accrued during construction, known as allowance for funds used during construction, could often equal the actual cost of the concrete and steel. To make the math work, utilities relied on rate-based guaranteed returns. Regulators allowed utilities to bake the massive cost of the plants into the monthly bills of every citizen, ensuring that the fortune was essentially a government-sanctioned tax on the future. However, the fortune was also deeply tied to the military-industrial subsidy. Much of the early research and development for civilian nuclear power was off-balance sheet for the utilities, as it was funded by the Department of Energy and military budgets for nuclear submarines. This was a massive hidden transfer of wealth from the taxpayer to the fixed grid. By 1970, there were hundreds of reactors planned globally. The wealth was being captured by the reactor vendors, giants like Westinghouse and General Electric, who shifted from being light bulb makers to being the architects of the most complex machines ever built. They sold nuclear islands for billions, creating a secondary market in high-tech maintenance and proprietary fuel rod assemblies that locked utilities into decades-long service contracts. This era marked the peak of technocratic centralization. The grid became a series of high-output fortresses operated by elite, specialized labor, creating a knowledge fortune for nuclear engineers and physicists. However, this centralization was a major vulnerability. Unlike coal plants, nuclear facilities required massive, all-or-nothing commitments. Financial risks were binary. You were either generating massive steady cash flow or sitting on a multi-billion-dollar monument to debt. The nuclear promise began to stall due to a dramatic shift in risk perception and regulatory costs. Following the 1979 accident at 3 Mile Island, the foundation of fortune was hit by a wave of safety inflation. New regulations required redundant systems upon redundant systems, causing the cost of a single plant to quadruple almost overnight. The grid was no longer just about the flow of electrons, it was about the cost of compliance. Many utilities that had bet the farm on nuclear found themselves facing bankruptcy as projects were abandoned mid-construction. The fortune turned into a stranded asset nightmare. In the U.S. alone, billions of dollars in nuclear investments were written off, proving that in the energy world, political risk can be more volatile than the atom itself. The final element of the nuclear era was the realization of the tail-end liability. Unlike coal ash or oil spills, nuclear waste requires a management horizon of 10,000 years. This introduced a negative fortune, a long-term debt that no private corporation could possibly carry on its books. The state had to step in as the insurer of last resort. This created a permanent entanglement between the grid and the government. The nuclear promise of free energy had evolved into a nuclear reality of high security, high cost, and high stability power. It became the silent giant of the grid, providing the reliable baseload that allowed the modern world to run 24/7, even as the search for the next fortune returned to the fossil fuels that were easier to burn and harder to regulate. The legacy here, the understanding that the grid has a limit to its complexity. As the nuclear dream cooled, the world's thirst for energy didn't shrink, it shifted back to the liquid fuels that were now being weaponized on the global stage. The foundation of fortune was about to move from the laboratory back to the bank, as energy became the literal backbone of the world's money. The nuclear promise offered a glimpse of a post-scarcity world, but the costs and risks were too high for the 20th century to swallow. As the atom retreated, the mobile grid of oil became so powerful that it actually took over the global financial system. In 1971, the global financial system suffered a heart attack. For decades, the world's currencies were tethered to the US dollar, which was itself tethered to gold. But as the costs of the Cold War and domestic spending mounted, President Richard Nixon closed the gold window, ending the Bretton Woods system. Suddenly, the dollar was backed by nothing but faith. The foundation of fortune was in free fall, and the global grid was staring into an abyss of hyperinflation. To save the dollar, the US had to tether it to something even more essential than gold, the mobile grid of oil. The primary financial driver of this era was the 1974 Saudi-US agreement. In a series of secret negotiations, the US offered the Saudi royal family a deal they couldn't refuse: total military protection and a guaranteed supply of advanced weaponry in exchange for one single condition: all Saudi oil sales must be priced exclusively in US dollars. By 1975, the rest of OPEC followed suit. This was the birth of the petrodollar, a system where the grid of energy became the literal backbone of the global reserve currency. The fortune was no longer just in the profit from the barrel, it was in the global demand for the currency required to buy that barrel. Petrodollar recycling forced nations to stockpile US dollars for oil. The US printed currency to purchase energy, which producers then reinvested into treasury bonds. This free lunch allowed the US to run massive deficits and fund military expansion by effectively taxing global energy consumption. This recycling process turned the global banking system into a giant energy clearinghouse. By the late 1970s, the foundation of fortune had shifted from the engineers who built pipelines to the bankers who managed the float. The massive cash reserves piling up in the Middle East, often called petroliquidity, had to go somewhere. Wall Street and London banks took these billions and loaned them out to developing nations in Latin America and Africa. The intent was to fund their own national energy grids, but it created a debt trap. These countries were borrowing dollars to buy oil that was priced in dollars. When the US Federal Reserve raised interest rates to 20% in the early 1980s to fight inflation, the cost of those energy debts exploded, leading to a decade of sovereign defaults. The grid had become a financial noose. This era also transformed the grid into a geopolitical weapon. During the 1973 oil embargo, OPEC realized that by restricting the flow of the mobile grid, they could cause the GDP of Western nations to collapse overnight. The price of a barrel of oil jumped from $3 to nearly $12 in a matter of months. This was the first time the foundation of fortune was used as a tool of sovereign extortion. The wealth didn't just move, it shifted geographically on a scale never before seen. Between 1973 and 1980, the wealth of the Arab oil-producing nations grew by an estimated $2.5 trillion in today's value. This great wealth transfer moved the center of global capital from the boardrooms of London and New York to the desert palaces of Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, funding the construction of hypermodern cities out of the sand. The petrodollar system also birthed the eurodollar market, a massive, unregulated pool of dollars held in banks outside the United States. This shadow grid of capital became the engine for globalization. It allowed multinational corporations to move billions across borders to build refineries, pipelines, and factories in the developing world without the oversight of national central banks. The fortune was now found in the spread between energy costs and interest rates. Furthermore, this era cemented the energy finance complex. The world's largest banks and the world's largest oil companies became two sides of the same coin. The pricing of oil moved from long-term, stable contracts between companies to the spot market and futures trading on the NYMEX. By the 1980s, the grid was no longer just a physical network of pipes and wires, it was a data stream of financial transactions. Speculators could now make fortunes of volatility by betting on the future price of energy without ever touching a drop of oil. The daily volume of oil traded on paper began to exceed the physical oil produced by 10 to 1. This financialization meant that a frost in Siberia or a rumor of war in the Persian Gulf could trigger a billion-dollar shift in global capital in milliseconds. The foundation of fortune was now built on the speed of information. The legacy here is the realization that in the modern world, energy is money. The petrodollar system ensured that the mobile grid remained the dominant force in global politics, outlasting the nuclear promise and the hydro hegemony. However, this total reliance on a single, fragile financial energy loop created a world that was always on, but perpetually on the brink. The grid was now so complex and so interconnected that a single failure in the system, be it a political coup, a currency collapse, or a technical glitch, could trigger a cascading failure that would darken entire continents and wipe out trillions in wealth. The petrodollar era turned the global grid into a high-stakes gambling hall where energy was the chips. But as the system grew larger and more interconnected, the world was about to learn a painful lesson about the fragility of the always-on civilization and the cost of total dependency. As the petrodollar system integrated the world into a single, high-speed financial and energetic circuit, it created a new kind of vulnerability, the cascading failure. By the late 20th century, the foundation of fortune was no longer just about owning the resource or the wire, it was about the reliability premium. In a world where hospitals, stock exchanges, and global supply chains ran on an always-on philosophy, the cost of a single second of darkness began to skyrocket. This era taught the world that the grid is not a collection of parts, but a living, breathing organism that can suffer a nervous breakdown. The primary financial driver of this era was the cost of downtime. In the early days of the copper web, a blackout was an inconvenience, you lit a candle and waited. By the 1970s and 80s, a blackout was a financial catastrophe. For a modern semiconductor factory or a digital data center, a power fluctuation lasting only milliseconds can result in losses of millions of dollars in ruined silicon or corrupted data. This created a secondary foundation of fortune in uninterruptible power supply and backup systems. Companies like APC and Caterpillar built multi-billion-dollar empires selling the insurance of energy. The fortune was made by betting against the very grid they helped power, selling the peace of mind that when the main system failed, your private island would stay lit. The foundation of fortune was also reshaped by the 1977 New York City blackout. This event was a masterclass in the societal cost of fragility. For 25 hours, the most powerful city on Earth descended into chaos, resulting in over $300 million in damages, roughly $1.5 billion today, from looting and arson. This event fundamentally changed the way the grid was financed. Investors and regulators realized that the grid was a public safety asset. This led to a massive wave of regulatory gold plating. Utilities were encouraged, and often mandated, to overbuild their systems. They spent billions on redundant transformers, hardened substations, and complex computerized control systems. The wealth was captured by the engineering and construction giants like Bechtel and ABB, who turned grid hardening into a permanent, high-margin revenue stream. The financial architecture of this period introduced the concept of systemic risk insurance. Because the grid had become a natural monopoly with critical infrastructure status, the government effectively became the ultimate backstop. If a utility failed due to a massive storm or a technical glitch, they could often pass the recovery costs directly to the consumer through rate hikes. This created a moral hazard fortune. Utility executives and shareholders were insulated from the true cost of failure, while the public bore the risk. The fortune was in the guaranteed recovery, turning the grid into a risk-free investment for the massive pension funds and insurance companies that own the utility stocks. However, the blackout lessons also birthed the deregulation experiment of the 1990s. Economists argued that the gold-plated monopoly model was too expensive. They pushed to unbundle the grid, separating the companies that generate power from the companies that deliver it. This was the Enron era, where the foundation of fortune moved into arbitrage and market manipulation. Traders realized they could make more money by creating artificial scarcity. During the 2000 to 2001 California energy crisis, companies intentionally shut down power plants for maintenance during heat waves to drive the spot price of electricity from $30 per megawatt hour to $1,500. This was the fortune of the squeeze, where the grid was treated not as a service, but as a casino. It resulted in rolling blackouts and the eventual bankruptcy of PG&E, the state's largest utility. Furthermore, these lessons highlighted the interdependency trap. The grid was no longer just about electricity, it was tethered to the natural gas grid. As coal and nuclear became politically difficult to build, utilities shifted to gas-fired plants for their flexibility. But this meant that a failure in a gas pipeline 500 miles away could cause a blackout in a city that had plenty of fixed grid capacity. The fortune moved toward the invisible fuel of natural gas, which could be turned on and off with the flick of a valve. This set the stage for the next massive pivot in global energy wealth, the move toward the bridge fuel that was cleaner than coal but just as geopolitically volatile as oil. In an always-on civilization, the entity that can guarantee uptime in the face of a cascading failure holds the ultimate leverage. The foundation of fortune began to move away from the massive, centralized fortresses of the 20th century toward a more modular, intelligent, and invisible system. The world was about to learn that the most valuable fuel wasn't the one you could see, but the one that could bridge the gap between the old world of fossils and the new world of the sun. The blackout lessons proved that the grid is a fragile web of trust and technology. But as the 21st century dawned, a new technology was about to unlock a massive, untapped reserve of energy hidden right beneath our feet, changing the map of global power once again. At the turn of the millennium, the foundation of fortune seemed trapped. Oil was volatile and tied to the petrodollar politics of the Middle East, coal was becoming a public relations nightmare, and nuclear was paralyzed by cost and fear. The global grid was hungry for a Goldilocks fuel, something that burned cleaner than coal but was as reliable as a light switch. This birthed the era of the natural gas bridge, a period where energy wealth moved from the heavy, visible infrastructure of the past into the microscopic pores of shale rock. The primary financial driver of this era was the fracking revolution. For decades, geologists knew that massive deposits of natural gas were trapped in shale formations like the Marcellus in Appalachia or the Barnett in Texas. But the wealth was locked behind the high cost of extraction until the combination of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing reached a commercial tipping point around 2005. This was a tech energy pivot. Suddenly, the U.S. moved from a projected importer of energy to the world's largest producer of natural gas. This created a fortune of abundance, crashing the price of gas from over $13 per million BTU to under $3 in just a few years. The financial architecture of the gas bridge was built on operational agility. Unlike the massive, slow-moving nuclear fortresses, a natural gas turbine could be built quickly and, more importantly, could be ramped up or down in minutes. This made gas the essential insurance policy for the grid. As the world began to experiment with intermittent renewables like wind and solar, natural gas became the grid stabilizer. The wealth was no longer just in selling the gas itself, but in capacity payments. Utilities were paid by the state just to keep their gas plants on standby, ready to fire up the second the wind stopped blowing. This turned the grid into a just-in-time delivery system, where the fortune was in the ready state. This era also saw the rise of the midstream tollgate. Because natural gas is a volatile, pressurized vapor, it cannot be easily moved without massive, specialized infrastructure. This created a new class of pipeline barons like Kinder Morgan and Enterprise Products Partners. These companies built the interstate highways of the molecular grid. Their business model was a return to the network toll of the railroads. They didn't care about the price of the gas, they cared about the volume. They signed take-or-pay contracts, ensuring that even if the gas didn't flow, the customer still paid for the capacity. This provided some of the most stable cash flows in the energy sector, attracting trillions in capital from yield-hungry investors like pension funds. To understand the scale of this bridge, one must look at the displacement of coal. Between 2005 and 2020, natural gas went from providing 19% of U.S. electricity to nearly 40%. This shift wasn't just environmental, it was a massive capital reallocation. Tens of billions of dollars in coal-fired assets were rendered stranded, while new capital flowed into high-efficiency combined-cycle gas turbines. These plants could achieve thermal efficiencies of over 60%, a massive leap from the 33% efficiency of older coal plants. This meant the foundation of fortune was found in the thermal delta, the ability to squeeze more electrons out of every molecule burned. The foundation of fortune then underwent a global expansion through liquefied natural gas. To turn a gas into a liquid, you must cool it to minus 162 degrees Celsius, shrinking its volume 600 times. This technology turned the fixed grid of local pipelines into a mobile grid of global tankers. This was the virtual pipeline era. Wealth moved into the liquefaction terminals, massive industrial cathedrals that cost upwards of $10 billion to build. By 2020, natural gas was being traded like oil, shipped from the US and Qatar to power the grids of Europe and Asia. The fortune was found in the global arbitrage, buying gas for $3 in Texas and selling it for $30 in Tokyo during a supply crunch. However, the bridge was built on a shaky political foundation. While gas was marketed as the clean alternative to coal, it was still a fossil fuel. This created a stranded asset risk. Investors began to worry that the trillions spent on pipelines and LNG terminals might become obsolete before they were paid off. This led to the rise of ESG, environmental, social, and governance investing, which began to starve the gas sector of cheap capital. The foundation of fortune was starting to smell like a liability. The grid was beginning to demand a future that didn't involve burning anything at all. Furthermore, the gas bridge era highlighted the vulnerability of the integrated molecule. Because natural gas was now used for both heating homes and generating electricity, a single winter storm could cause a dual grid failure. If the gas froze at the wellhead, the lights went out. If the lights went out, the gas pumps failed. This interdependency crisis proved that even the most abundant fuel is only as good as the reliability of the system delivering it. It set the stage for the final, most disruptive move, leaving the molecule behind and returning to the electron, but this time, the grid would belong to everyone. The legacy here: the bridge to nowhere paradox. Natural gas saved the grid from the inefficiency of coal and the volatility of oil, but it became a victim of its own success. It made energy so cheap and so reliable that it removed the urgency for a total transition, until the sun and the wind became even cheaper. The fortune was now preparing for its final frontier, the capture of the sky itself. In the final movement of the grid, the foundation of fortune is undergoing its most radical inversion since the days of James Watt. For over a century, the grid was a one-way street. Energy was generated in a massive, centralized fortress and pushed out to a passive consumer. But as we move through the 2020s, we have entered the era of the solar surge. This is a period defined by the violent collapse of energy costs and the total democratization of the electron. The grid is transforming from a rigid, top-down hierarchy into a fluid, hyperconnected ecosystem where the very concept of centralized power is being dismantled by the physics of the silicon wafer. The primary financial driver of this era is Swanson's law, the solar industry's equivalent to Moore's law. It dictates that every time the world doubles its cumulative production of solar panels, the cost of those panels drops by roughly 20%. Since 2010, the cost of solar energy has plummeted by nearly 90%, making it the cheapest source of electricity in human history. This has created a fortune of ubiquity. Unlike oil, coal, or gas, which require massive geological luck and multi-billion-dollar extraction machines, the fuel for the solar surge falls on every rooftop for free. The foundation of fortune has shifted permanently from the commodity, the fuel, to the technology, the capture. The financial architecture of this transition is built on distributed capital. In every previous segment, the grid was built by titans, men like Rockefeller, Morgan, and Insull, who could raise millions to build a dam or a refinery. In the solar surge, the grid is being built by millions of individual actors. Every homeowner or business that installs a solar array is essentially building their own private power plant. This is the prosumer revolution. By 2025, the fortune is being captured by companies that provide the hardware and intelligence, firms like Tesla, Sunrun, and Enphase. Their business model isn't selling energy by the kilowatt-hour, it is selling the infrastructure of independence, allowing the individual to unplug from the traditional monopolies that have ruled since the War of Currents. However, the solar surge brings a massive challenge, the intermittency gap. Because solar is a pulsed energy source, thriving at noon and vanishing at midnight, it has birthed the most valuable secondary foundation of fortune in history, the battery buffer. Because the grid can no longer rely on baseload fuel, it requires a massive amount of storage to survive. This has turned lithium into the new oil and copper into the new gold. The wealth has shifted to the gigafactories, where the goal is to drive down the cost of storage as aggressively as the cost of the panels. The fortune is no longer found in the production of energy, but in the arbitrage of time, storing a photon when it is abundant and releasing it when it is precious. This era is also giving rise to the virtual power plant, VPP, the ultimate invisible grid. Instead of a utility building a new $2 billion gas plant, a software provider can link together 50,000 home batteries into a single, coordinated network. Using artificial intelligence, the software can pull a tiny amount of energy from every home simultaneously to stabilize the regional grid. The foundation of fortune has moved into algorithms and orchestration. The winner of this era isn't the person with the most coal in the ground, but the person with the best code to manage the flow of millions of decentralized nodes. Energy has become a cloud service, and the grid is now a subset of the Internet of Things. The most disruptive impact of the solar surge is the death spiral of the traditional utility. As the most profitable customers, wealthy homeowners and large corporations, move toward self-generation, they pay less into the central system. This forces utilities to raise prices on the remaining customers to maintain the aging copper web, which in turn incentivizes even more people to switch to solar. This positive feedback loop is threatening the survival of the 100-year-old utility monopoly. The foundation of fortune is moving away from the fixed asset and toward the network layer. The utilities that survive will be those that stop trying to sell electrons and start acting as the traffic controllers of a peer-to-peer energy market. As we look at the grid today, we see a system that has become smart, small, and silent. The foundation of fortune has traveled from the soot of the coal mine to the pressure of the piston, through the liquid of the pipe and the pulse of the wire, and finally into the silence of the silicon wafer. We have moved from a world of scarcity and control to a world of abundance and access. The grid is no longer a machine we are plugged into, it is a web we are a part of. The ultimate fortune is no longer held by a handful of kings, it is being reclaimed by the physics of the sky and the ingenuity of the individual. The story of the grid is the story of humanity's attempt to master the flow of the universe. We have gone from shivering in the dark to commanding the light of the stars with a wafer of sand. The grid is our greatest achievement, and its final form is just beginning to shine. As the solar surge proved that the sky could be harvested for energy, a massive, invisible twin began to reshape the foundation of fortune once again. This was the era of the wind rush, a period where wealth was no longer pulled from the ground or captured by stationary panels, but intercepted from the very movement of the atmosphere. While solar was a revolution of the individual and the roof, wind became the revolution of the industrial scale and the open frontier. It was the return of the grand machine, but this time, it was built of composite fibers and reached heights that rivaled skyscrapers. The primary financial driver of this era was the logistics of scale. Wind energy follows a brutal physical law. The power output of a turbine is proportional to the square of its blade length and the cube of the wind speed. This created a fortune of size. In the early 2000s, a standard turbine produced roughly 1 megawatt. By the mid-2020s, offshore giants were producing 15 megawatts each, enough to power a small town with a single rotation. The wealth was captured by the industrial leaders, companies like Vestas, Siemens Gamesa, and GE Vernova, who mastered the specialized manufacturing and maritime logistics required to plant these 800-foot towers in the middle of the North Sea or the Great Plains. The financial architecture of the wind rush was defined by power purchase agreements. Because a wind farm is a multi-billion-dollar capital commitment with almost zero OpEx, fuel is free, it requires absolute revenue certainty to attract investors. This birthed a new foundation of fortune in corporate decarbonization. Tech giants like Google, Amazon, and Microsoft, hungry for 24/7 green electrons to power their AI data centers, became the new utility kings. They signed 20-year contracts to buy every electron a wind farm produced before the first turbine was even bolted to the floor. This turned the grid into a synthetic financial asset, where the fortune wasn't just in the wind, but in the credit rating of the buyer. However, the wind rush faced a massive geographic hurdle: the transmission gap. The best wind is often found in the most remote places, the middle of nowhere or far out at sea, while the people are in the cities. This created a secondary foundation of fortune in high-voltage direct current technology. If the war of currents was won by AC, the wind rush is being won by a return to DC for long-distance transport. The wealth moved to the interconnector barons, the entities building the massive subsea cables and transcontinental lines that act as the sino-global arteries of the new grid. These are the modern-day Silk Roads, moving the energy of the prairie to the skyscrapers of the coast. The foundation of fortune also underwent a transformation through offshore sovereignty. In the North Sea and off the American coast, the grid moved into the commons. This required a new kind of regulatory alchemy. Governments began auctioning off wind leases for billions of dollars. In a single 2022 auction off the coast of New York and New Jersey, companies paid a staggering $4.37 billion just for the right to build. The fortune was being split between the state, which acted as the landlord of the winds, and the massive energy majors like Ørsted and Equinor, who pivoted from oil rigs to wind foundations to protect their status as the world's primary energy providers. But the wind rush brought its own unique resource risk: the variable lull. Unlike the predictable day-night cycle of solar, wind can vanish for weeks in a phenomenon known in Europe as dunkelflater, the dark doldrums. This has forced the grid to evolve into a hybrid network. The fortune moved into the diversification play, investing in wind-solar storage clusters that use AI to balance the erratic moods of the weather. The grid is no longer a steady hum. It is a symphony of fluctuations, and the wealth belongs to the conductors who can harmonize these massive, irregular pulses of power into a single, reliable stream. The grid has finally reached a global, planetary scale. We have moved from the black diamond coal mine to the invisible river of the air. The foundation of fortune is no longer about hoarding a pile of fuel, it is about the mastery of the flow. We are no longer just consuming the Earth's stored past. We are living off its active, kinetic present. As the grid transitioned to the intermittent pulses of the sun and wind, the foundation of fortune moved from the furnace to the battery. In all previous eras, energy was a burn-on-demand commodity. In the new era, energy is a capture and store asset. This shifted the global power struggle to a single, ultralight alkali metal, lithium. If the 20th century was defined by the quest for black gold, oil, the 21st is being defined by the scramble for white gold. The primary financial driver of this era is electrochemical potential. Lithium is the lightest metal on the periodic table and possesses the highest electrochemical potential, making it the perfect medium for moving ions back and forth with minimal weight. This created a fortune of the cell. As the mobile grid, electric vehicles, and the fixed grid, home utility storage, began to merge, the demand for lithium-ion batteries entered a vertical spike. This wasn't just a mining boom, it was the construction of the world's first global energy buffer. The wealth was no longer in the flow of fuel, but in the capacity to hold it. The financial architecture of the lithium gold mine is defined by vertical integration 2.0. Unlike the seven sisters of oil who bought the wells and the pumps, the new battery barons, led by titans like Elon Musk, Tesla, and Wang Chuanfu, BYD, realized that the foundation of fortune was in the refining and chemistry. The wealth didn't just belong to the person who pulled the lithium out of the brine, it belonged to the person who could process it into high-purity battery-grade material. This birthed the gigafactory model, where the mine, the chemical plant, and the assembly line are geographically and financially linked to squeeze out every penny of margin per kilowatt-hour. This era also birthed the new OPEC of minerals. Because lithium is so critical, the foundation of fortune is being protected by a new type of cartelization. Countries like Zimbabwe and Indonesia have begun banning the export of raw lithium ore, demanding that foreign investors build processing plants within their borders. This is value addition nationalism. They are no longer content to be the pit for the world's wealth, they want to be the lab. For investors, this adds a layer of political risk premium that didn't exist in the early days of the solar surge. The fortune is now a high-stakes game of diplomacy and industrial blackmail, where the grid is used as a bargaining chip for national development. Furthermore, the scale of capital required has led to the commoditization of the future. To secure the billions needed for new mines, companies are using offtake agreements as collateral. These are paper fortunes, contracts where an automaker agrees to buy a mine's entire output for the next 10 years at a set price. This has allowed the banking sector to financialize the Earth's crust in a way we haven't seen since the gold standard. Wall Street is no longer just trading stocks, it is trading forward-dated atoms. This creates a bullwhip effect in the market, where a small change in EV demand can cause a catastrophic collapse in lithium prices, wiping out billions in paper wealth overnight. The foundation of fortune also underwent a geopolitical realignment. Much of the world's lithium is concentrated in the lithium triangle, Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia, as well as Australia, but the refining grid is dominated by China, which controls the vast majority of global lithium processing. This has created a new kind of resource nationalism. Nations are no longer just fighting over pipelines, they are fighting over supply chain security. The US and Europe are now spending hundreds of billions in subsidies, like the Inflation Reduction Act, to reshore the battery grid. The fortune is being fueled by geopolitical anxiety, as governments treat battery minerals as a matter of national survival. Furthermore, this era introduced the circular fortune of recycling. Unlike coal or gas, which are destroyed when used, lithium is infinitely reusable. This is creating the urban mining sector. Companies like Redwood Materials are betting that the foundation of fortune in 2040 won't be in a hole in the ground, but in the millions of spent batteries from the first generation of EVs. The grid is becoming a closed-loop system, where the same atom of lithium might power a car in 2025, a home in 2035, and a hospital in 2050. The wealth is moving from extraction to stewardship, creating a secondary market of legacy lithium that will eventually compete with the mines themselves. However, the lithium gold mine represents a physical bottleneck. Even with the most efficient mines, the physical world moves slower than the digital world. You can build a solar farm in months, but a lithium mine takes a decade to reach full production. This time lag created a massive speculative premium. The fortune was made by those who secured supply contracts years in advance, effectively betting on the battery before the rest of the world realized the grid had no other choice. This lag also incentivizes the search for alternative chemistries, like sodium-ion or solid-state, as the market tries to engine around the lithium scarcity. The new grid is a material asset play. We have traded a flow economy, buying fuel every day, for a stock economy, buying the storage once. But having the batteries is only half the battle. To make millions of decentralized batteries work as a single, coherent machine, the grid requires a level of intelligence it has never possessed before. The white gold provided the muscles, now the grid needs a brain. With the solar surge and lithium gold mine delivering a decentralized flood of electrons, the 100-year-old network reached its breaking point. The old grid was a dumb pipe, it only knew how to push power from a central plant to a passive wall socket. But in the mid-2020s, the foundation of fortune moved into the neural layer. This is the era of the smart grid, where the network stopped being a piece of hardware and started being a piece of software. The fortune is no longer in the wire, but in the orchestration of the million-part harmony of modern life. The primary financial driver of this era is demand-side arbitrage. In the old world, utilities built billion-dollar peaker plants just to handle the 2 hours of peak demand on a hot summer afternoon. In the smart grid, AI doesn't build new plants, it shaves the peak. By 2026, the negawatt, a watt of energy not used, has become more valuable than a watt of energy generated. Through AI-driven demand response, software providers like NVIDIA and Palantir coordinate with utilities to nudge millions of smart appliances, home batteries, and EVs to lower their intake during peak stress. This eliminates the need for massive capital expenditures, shifting the profit from the construction crews to the algorithm designers. The financial architecture of the smart grid is defined by virtual power plants, VPPs. As of early 2026, the concept of a centralized utility is being replaced by an invisible, distributed network. A VPP uses blockchain and AI to aggregate thousands of home batteries and solar arrays into a single, cohesive block of power. This is the gigawatt of the people. Instead of a utility company owning the asset, the fortune is split between the aggregator, who manages the code, and the homeowner, who owns the battery. These VPPs can respond to grid frequency drops in milliseconds, a feat no coal or nuclear plant could ever achieve. The wealth is being captured by those who build the digital handshake that allows a Tesla in a driveway to talk to a substation 50 miles away. Furthermore, 2026 marks the arrival of vehicle-to-grid, V2G, at scale. In this smart era, the 250 million electric vehicles predicted to be on global roads by 2030 are no longer just cars, they are mobile grid nodes. Regulatory breakthroughs, such as the 2025 amendments in the EU and North America, have finally dismantled the double charging fees that once killed V2G economics. Now, your car makes money while it sits in your garage. By discharging a fraction of its battery during peak hours and recharging when solar is abundant and prices are negative, an EV becomes a revenue-generating asset. The foundation of fortune has moved into the energy interface, where the charger is the new service station and the car is the new battery farm. To understand the sheer scale of this digital expansion, one must look at the computational feedback loop. The AI that manages the grid is also one of the grid's hungriest customers. In 2026, the energy consumed by data centers training the next generation of grid brains has rivaled the consumption of entire nations. This has created a fortune of proximity, where data centers are being built directly adjacent to nuclear plants or massive solar arrays to bypass the transmission bottleneck. The grid is no longer just powering cities, it is powering the very mind that keeps those cities alive. This intelligence also enables the microgrid revolution. For the first time since the copper web consolidated, we are seeing a mass defection from the centralized model. Hospitals, military bases, and even entire gated communities are deploying AI-orchestrated microgrids that can island themselves from the main network during a storm or cyber attack. These entities no longer buy energy as a commodity, they buy resilience as a service. The financial fortune here is in the security premium, the ability to guarantee 100% uptime in an increasingly volatile world. However, this intelligence creates a new foundation of risk, cyber resilience. As the grid becomes a network of everything, it becomes a prime target for state-level cyber warfare. A single exploit in a smart meter firmware could, in theory, trigger a cascading blackout across a continent. This has birthed a $100 billion cybersecurity fortune. The white hat companies that act as the immune system for the grid are now as essential as the engineers who string the wires. The fortune is being made by those who can guarantee uptime in a hostile code environment using zero-trust architectures, where every electron must prove its origin before it crosses a transformer. The legacy here is the dematerialization of power. We have moved from the heavy, thumping pistons of the 19th century to the silent, invisible logic of the 21st. The grid has evolved from a machine into an artificial organism. It thinks, it predicts, and it breathes in sync with the sun. But as we mastered the efficiency of the electron, a new market emerged, one that didn't trade energy at all, but rather the guilt of the carbon left behind by our ancestors. The smart grid has perfected the flow of electrons, making the network invisible and intelligent. But as the physical grid stabilized, the financial world created a new, parallel grid, one that tracks every molecule of CO2 as a tradable asset. As the smart grid in the previous chapter began to master the flow of the electron, a parallel, invisible grid emerged to track its shadow. For over a century, the foundation of fortune was built on externalizing the cost of pollution, reaping the profits of energy while leaving the atmosphere to foot the bill. But by April 2026, the era of the free exhaust pipe has ended. This is the era of the carbon market, where the grid has been tethered to a global ledger of accountability. The fortune is no longer found solely in the production of energy, but in the accounting of the molecule. The primary financial driver of this era is the internalization of the externality. In 2026, the invisible cost of CO2 has become a hard-coded line item on every corporate balance sheet. In the European Union, the emissions trading system has reached a historic milestone, with carbon permits climbing toward the €100 per ton mark. This has turned the atmosphere into a finite, high-priced commodity. For a utility, a dirty electron from a coal plant now carries a carbon tax that can double its price, while a clean electron from a wind farm becomes a source of revenue. The wealth is being captured by the low-carbon arbitrageurs, entities that can generate energy without the associated liability. The financial architecture of this segment is defined by the convergence of compliance and voluntary markets. For years, these were two separate worlds, one mandated by governments and the other driven by corporate guilt. In 2026, they have merged into a single, high-integrity financial system. Japan's GXETS, Green Transformation Emissions Trading Scheme, became mandatory, covering nearly 1 billion tons of emissions and allowing companies to meet 10% of their obligations through high-quality carbon credits. This has birthed the fortune of integrity. The market has moved away from the oversupply era of cheap, questionable offsets to a quality premium era. Investors now seek A-rated credits, verified by AI and satellite monitoring, that guarantee permanent carbon removal. A massive shift in the foundation of fortune has occurred through the geopolitics of the molecule. As of early 2026, the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism is no longer a pilot program, it is a live commercial reality. This is effectively a climate tariff on the grid. If a nation produces steel or cement using high carbon energy, that product is taxed at the border to match the EU's carbon price. This has turned the grid into a competitive grade. Nations like India and China are racing to launch their own national carbon markets to keep that tax revenue within their own borders. Energy is no longer just a commodity, it is a passport of entry into the global market. The technology of this era is the tokenized ledger. To manage the billions of microtransactions required to track carbon from a specific solar farm to a specific consumer, the grid has adopted blockchain-based carbon credits. This prevents double counting, the original sin of the early carbon markets. The fortune is being made by the carbon exchanges like ICE, Expansive, and ACX, which have turned carbon into a liquid, 24/7 tradable asset class. By 2026, the global carbon market has exceeded $1 trillion in total value, rivaling the size of the oil market it is designed to replace. Furthermore, we are seeing the rise of nature-based and engineered wealth. The grid now extends into the forests of the Amazon and the direct air capture, DAC, plants in Iceland. Landowners are no longer just farmers, they are carbon sequestrators. The foundation of fortune has moved into the biomass and the pore space of the earth. Companies like Microsoft and Amazon are signing multi-billion-dollar forward offtake agreements for durable removals, essentially pre-funding the construction of a new kind of negative energy infrastructure. We have moved from a world where the grid was a product to a world where it is a balance sheet. The foundation of fortune is now found in the zero-sum game of the atmosphere. The grid is no longer just a provider of light and heat, it is the enforcer of a global climate treaty, where every electron must prove its innocence. The carbon market has turned the grid into a global moral ledger. But while we have mastered the accounting of the old fuels, The world is still hungry for an energy source that is both infinite and entirely clean. To find it, the grid is turning away from the chemistry of the Earth and toward the physics of the stars. For 70 years, the joke among physicists was that fusion was the energy of the future, and it always would be. But by April 2026, the punchline has vanished. The foundation of fortune has undergone its most profound shift yet, moving from the laboratory to the industrial construction site. In this era, we are no longer trying to prove fusion, we are trying to productize it. The fortune is no longer found in the incremental gains of a government experiment, but in the frantic race to deliver the first commercial electron to the grid by 2028. The primary financial driver of this era is the data center demand. In 2026, the insatiable hunger of generative AI has created a power gap that wind and solar alone cannot fill. Wind is too variable, solar is too intermittent for the 24/7 uptime required by the world's GPU clusters. This has led to the big tech sovereign era. Microsoft's 2023 agreement with Helion Energy to buy 50 megawatts of fusion power by 2028 was the starting gun. Now, in 2026, we see OpenAI, Google, and Nvidia pouring billions into fusion PPA, power purchase agreement, deals. These tech giants are no longer just energy customers, they are the venture capitalists of the star. They are pre-funding the grid because their trillion-dollar AI models cannot exist without it. The financial architecture of the fusion frontier is defined by the AI physics convergence. In March 2026, the UK government unveiled the Sunrise AI supercomputer, a £45 million facility dedicated solely to simulating plasma stability. This has turned the grid into a generative design problem. For decades, the hurdle was the magnetic bottle, the inability to keep a 100 million degree plasma stable. Instead of building a reactor and hoping it works, AI now allows companies like Commonwealth Fusion Systems and Takamak Energy to run trillions of virtual experiments, solving the taming the star problem in silicon before they ever pour concrete. The fortune belongs to the entities that own the algorithmic IP that keeps the plasma from touching the walls. This shift is enabled by a new foundation of fortune in materials science, high-temperature superconducting magnets. In the 20th century, magnets required liquid helium and massive cooling systems, making reactors the size of cathedrals, like the multi-decade ITER project. In 2026, the wealth is in the compact reactor. Using barium copper oxide tapes, startups are building reactors that fit inside a warehouse. This allows for serial manufacturing. If you can build a fusion reactor on an assembly line rather than a decade-long construction site, the cost of capital collapses. The fortune is being made by those who can move energy production from civil engineering to product manufacturing. Furthermore, we are seeing the rise of fusion-hardened real estate. In early 2026, the first fusion enterprise zones were established in Virginia and Nottinghamshire. These are sites where the regulatory red tape of fission has been surgically removed. Unlike traditional nuclear power, fusion cannot melt down. If the power goes out, the star simply turns off. Regulators in 2026 have recognized this intrinsic safety, allowing fusion plants to be sited directly adjacent to high-density cities and industrial parks. The foundation of fortune is found in the regulatory delta, the ability to build a high-output power source without the 10,000-year liability or the massive exclusion zones of the past. However, a new foundation of risk has emerged, the tritium bottleneck. Fusion, specifically the deuterium-tritium reaction, requires a rare isotope of hydrogen that currently costs approximately $30,000 per gram. Historically, the world's supply came from aging heavy water fission reactors. In April 2026, this scarcity has birthed the lithium-breeding fortune. To be commercially viable, a fusion reactor must be a breeder. It must surround its core with a blanket of lithium that, when struck by neutrons, creates its own tritium fuel. The grid's future now depends on this closed-loop fuel cycle. The wealth is moving to the fuel cycle architects who can ensure a reactor never needs to wait for a delivery. We are also witnessing the financialization of the plasma. In 2026, we see the birth of fusion futures on the commodities markets. Investors are no longer just betting on the price of electricity, they are betting on first light milestones. The foundation of fortune has moved into the pre-revenue speculation phase. Because the potential payday of fusion is essentially infinite energy, the valuation of fusion startups has reached decacorn status, $10 billion plus, before a single watt has been sold. This is a return to the Wild West speculation of the 1880s oil boom, but played out at the speed of light in the private equity boardrooms of Silicon Valley and Dubai. For the first time in human history, we are not burning the Earth's stored sunlight, fossil fuels, or even capturing its current sunlight, renewables. We are creating our own. The foundation of fortune is no longer about the scarcity of a resource, but the absolute mastery of complexity. We have moved from being planetary consumers to universal architects. We are no longer just living on a planet, we are beginning to power one with the same physics that lights the galaxy. The fusion frontier has promised us the power of the stars. But as the first modular reactors prepare to synchronize with the smart grid, we are approaching a moment of economic singularity. We are nearing a point where energy becomes so abundant and so cheap that it ceases to be a commodity at all. We have reached the terminal velocity of the foundation of fortune. For 250 years, the grid was defined by scarcity, the desperate, often violent struggle to extract, refine, and control the limited flow of energy. But as of late 2026, the logic of the machine has inverted. We are entering the era of the infinite joules, a period where the marginal cost of a kilowatt-hour is trending toward zero, and the grid is transitioning from a utility into a planetary life support system. The primary financial driver of this final era is the abundance paradox. In a world of infinite energy, the commodity itself becomes worthless. In April 2026, we are seeing the first signs of this post-scarcity economy. During peak solar and wind hours, wholesale electricity prices in many global markets have become consistently negative. This has destroyed the traditional utility business model of selling units. The new foundation of fortune is found in utilization and transformation. If energy is free, the wealth moves to the person who can use the most of it to create high-value physical matter, from green hydrogen and desalinated water to direct air carbon capture. The grid is no longer a light switch, it is a universal factory. To navigate this paradox, the financial world has invented the Zero Marginal Cost Fund. These are trillion-dollar investment vehicles that prioritize the civilizational floor. By funding the installation of infinite energy sources, these funds are essentially prepaying for 50 years of human progress. This has led to the erosion of the bill. In several Nordic and Mediterranean test cities, electricity bills have been abolished entirely, replaced by a grid access fee that is lower than a modern Netflix subscription. The fortune is no longer in the energy itself, but in the human productivity that energy unleashes. When light is free, people work, create, and innovate at a scale that was previously restricted by the tax of the piston. Furthermore, 2026 marks the rise of the compute energy singularity. As the AI orchestrator manages the grid, it has realized that the most efficient way to store energy isn't just in lithium, it's in knowledge. We are seeing the birth of energy-matched computing, where massive AI training runs only occur when the grid is in abundance mode. This has created the digital battery. When there is an excess of solar energy in the Sahara, it is immediately converted into the processing power required to solve cancer or design new materials. The foundation of fortune is found in the elasticity of demand. The winners are those who can turn their massive industrial loads on and off in milliseconds, acting as a digital sponge for the overflow of the infinite joules. The financial architecture of the infinite joules is defined by the Type 1 transition. According to the Kardashev scale, a Type 1 civilization can harness all the energy that reaches its planet. In 2026, with the convergence of the solar surge, the wind rush, and the fusion frontier, humanity is effectively making its bid for Type 1 status. The fortune is being captured by the system architects, the sovereign wealth funds and supernation entities that are building the global interconnectors. These are the ultra-high voltage arteries that move the infinite joules across time zones, ensuring that a sunlit desert in Australia can power a midnight data center in London. The wealth is in the connectivity. However, the infinite era brings a final, philosophical foundation of risk, the limits of the biosphere. Even if energy is free and carbon neutral, the laws of thermodynamics still apply. If we continue to scale our energy use at 3% a year, the waste heat alone would eventually cook the planet. This has birthed the efficiency fortune of the late 2020s. The wealth is moving away from more power and toward extreme miniaturization and biological integration. We are seeing the rise of biogrids, where living systems are engineered to interface with the electrical network. The grid is moving from the macro, power plants, to the micro, energy harvesting materials. The legacy of the grid is the story of a species that learned to stop burning its past and started living on its future. The foundation of fortune began in a dark hole in a Newcastle coal mine and ended with the mastery of the star. We have built a machine so large and so intelligent that it has become invisible. Energy is no longer a bill we pay, it is the atmosphere of progress. The grid is finished. The world is just beginning. Energy is the currency of the universe. When you make the currency free, the only limit is your imagination.